Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dark Finds podcast. On today's episode, we have Professor Philip Hyland of Maynooth University in Ireland. Phil is a prolific psychology researcher with over 340 publications and over 12,000 citations. His main area of research is on psychological response to traumatic life events and disorders associated with stress. In this episode, we discuss psychopathy, post-traumatic stress disorder, personality traits, evolutionary psychology, mental health, and so much more. Phil is a bastion of knowledge and brings a very well-educated and unique perspective to the world of psychology. More interesting elements of psychology, which was, the abnormal or the criminal. So I suppose with that, speaking of the criminal psychology, when I was writing the book, one of the main areas I was researching into was around like psychopathy, psychopaths, sociopaths. I suppose the first question I want to ask you, because I see a bit of debate online, in your opinion or from your research, is there a difference between psychopathy and sociopathy?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't think so. I think my understanding, and I've yet to see anything that would contradict this, is that they're just two terms basically used to define the same thing. Um, uh, my sense is that people more from a kind of social science background, sociology, tend to use the word sociopathy, whereas psychologists, psychiatrists tend to use the term psychopathy. So no, I certainly think of two words for the same thing.
Yeah, and that's the debate you see online. Some people are coming from it like there's a clear distinction where I suppose the sociopath is able to turn on and off their almost emotional side, or are able to go from numb to rage and stuff like that. But again, it doesn't really fit with what we'd know about, I suppose, brain structure as well. That, if you have an underperforming amygdala, or that kind of fear center is turned off, for want of a better word,
Yeah.
I don't know if it can be switched on and off as some people would suggest online.
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously people vary in how good they are at regulating their emotions or feigning emotions and faking emotions. Um, but no, I don't think that really captures the a distinction that exists between sociopathy and psychopathy. It is an interesting one. I mean, I'm probably guilty of not really studying it too much. I guess I've just always kind of viewed it as psychopathy.
Yeah.
There may well be an interesting history on, where the terms originated and how they diverged and why these terms get used. But no, I think for all intents and purposes, whenever I hear somebody in the media or somebody online talking about sociopathy, I it always strikes my ears that they're discussing psychopathy. Um, and yeah, as I said, I think it is just depending on where you're coming from, more of a psychological versus sociology background, you tend to use the different term. But I think in the literature, in the empirical literature and the scientific literature, it's psychopathy that's used more frequently.
Yeah. And I suppose one of my favorite types of lectures with you was when you went down into the more evolutionary route.
All right.
I always
Okay.
found that fascinating, because I think it's always really interesting to maybe trace the genesis of a behavior. And with psychopathy in particular, what would, from your understanding, what would you see maybe the evolutionary, why did this evolve and why did it last? Why wasn't it, I suppose, erased out of the gene pool? Because obviously it has its certain hallmarks of being, a very negative trait within a human. Like, well, depending on which subset maybe you're seeing, when people are in business and they can perform, I suppose, more coldly when it needs that. It can be maybe seen as a pro-social behavior, but largely what we're seeing with it, it's an antisocial behavior. So Yeah, where would the genesis, or what's the evolutionary impact or benefit of maybe someone having more psychopathic traits?
It's an interesting one. I think first of all, it's nice to hear, I guess, that you're interested in the evolutionary side. I think sometimes people can people can have mixed views, I guess, on evolutionary perspectives on psychology and psychological traits. I don't understand it. What we're interested in as psychologists is the mind very often. The human mind, human behavior. Obviously, the mind is what the brain does. The brain is a physical, biological organ. And therefore, all of our psychology and all of our behavior is in some sense constrained by our biology. So we do know that psychopathy is largely explained in terms of genes. So whichever way you look at it, I mean, we'll probably get into this, but I suppose we can think about psychopathy in different ways. But at the very least, about 50% of all of the sort of variation in individuals' variance in psychopathic traits are due to genetic factors. Right? So about 50% of all individual differences are due to genes. The other 50% is due to the environment. So there are genes play a role in the development of this personality trait. Um, why it evolved? Hard to say. I suppose here you now look at two different things. A trait can evolve because it confers survival advantage. A trait can evolve because it confers reproductive advantage, or a trait can evolve by accident. Right? It serves no useful function per se. It's a sort of accidental outcrop of some other genes that give rise to traits that do have survival or reproductive advantage. So I guess we don't know for sure if psychopathy, the genes that give rise to this trait that we call psychopathy, have they been selected for because they conferred survival advantage, reproductive advantage, or is it more of a kind of accidental trait? It's very likely. It's very, 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 very likely, I think, that these traits do confer reproductive and or survival advantages under certain conditions, um, and I suppose the important thing to keep in mind is that genes and environment always interact, right? And we know some of the genes, we don't have by any means a perfect picture of which genes are involved in the development of psychopathy, but from what we do know, we know that the genes interact with environments, and that people who are born with certain genetic vulnerabilities that we think predispose them to psychopathy, if they are born into an environment of high stress, high violence, they're much more likely to go on and develop these traits and these psychological dispositions consistent with psychopathy. Whereas if you're born with a genetic disposition for psychopathy and you're born into an environment, or you grow up in an environment full of care and love and kindness, then you're much less likely to develop all of these negative traits that we associate with psychopathy. So I guess there's some interesting research that looks at what women find attractive in men um, in different contexts. So first of all, one of the kind of coolest findings I think that's come out of this area is that women seem to have a better than chance ability to detect features of psychopathy in men simply from looking at their faces, right?
Yeah.
So if you take a group of people and you get them to fill out all these personality assessments, personality questionnaires, and then you just take a picture of their face, right? People in general cannot judge a book by its cover, right? They can't tell who's extroverted, who's introverted, who's emotionally stable, who's not emotionally stable, none of that kind of stuff. Except for one interesting case, which is women's ability to detect men who have high levels of psychopathy simply from looking at pictures of their faces.
Yeah.
Right?
And I remember, Phil, I remember in one of your classes, and this stuck with me, this study. I think it was based out in the Middle East, where women were, I think, not only were they able to spot psychopathy on a male counterpart, but they also was like a marriage selection. They were more likely to. I know I could be butchering this, so I'm going to let you continue. But that really, I think that was a huge formation in the book as well, to have, someone that is, because it's the, I don't know if it's the eyes or what it is, and maybe that's very pop psychology, but there definitely seems to be. It's really interesting that they would choose maybe a mate based on them sociopathy factors.
Yeah, so there seems to be some ability, particularly in women, to detect features of psychopathy in men. So you say, okay, that's interesting. Well, why did that evolve? And then you go on and you ask, well, do women find the features of psychopathy attractive in men um, under different circumstances? And the answer is yes, but it depends. In very high conflict environments, so in regions of the world that have been characterized by a lot of violence and a lot of ongoing, war and conflict, whatever, um, in those environments, women tend to find the features of psychopathy to be highly attractive. In very peaceful, non-conflict ridden regions of the world, when women are asked, well, do you find these kind of features of a man to be attractive? They typically say no, right? So why did they evolve? Why have these genes been selected for? Well, it's possible under, certain, for the vast majority of the time in which humans existed, the world was a violent,
Yeah,
awful place where, most people are out to kill you, right?
yeah,
These are, rates of violence are incredibly high. And, tendencies, I suppose, features of psychopathy, like callousness, like, quick to violence, manipulativeness, basically just win at all costs, may have conferred a survival advantage, and therefore being selected for, and may have also conferred a reproductive advantage because maybe these people were being more likely to survive having more resources, were more attractive to members of the opposite sex, and therefore you have that reproductive advantage as well. um, but again, I suppose it's always important to keep in mind that it's rarely, if ever, as straightforward as there's a given gene, and in all contexts, under all times, it codes for certain kinds of behavioral traits. Um, but certainly, there does seem to be some evidence that in you know areas of the world, or in contexts where violence is very common, um, features of psychopathy do confer both survival and reproductive advantage. So that's probably a very, very long winded way of answering your question as to why these things were selected for through evolutionary history.
yeah. It might make sense if you're in a high conflict zone, maybe having starting a family, or maybe being a partner with someone that is capable of protecting you. Maybe it's not even about, it's a protective element, which is really interesting. I think I seen a movie, was it The Northman or something, I watched there recently, which is like, I think it did so well because it shows like the level of, when we think of violence, we probably put it into a modern context and trying to, you know, project it back into time. But I think in that movie they went in, you just got to feel the sense at the level of, brutality that existed, where, you kind of want the most psychopathic person maybe to protect you if that's the marauding tribe coming to,
Exactly.
raise your village.
Exactly. I think people find it very, very, very hard to imagine what the world must have been like 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, however long, 200,000 years ago when we started to evolve, or when our species first evolved. Um, yeah, so violence is so rare and so uncommon in our society now
Yeah.
that. it is very, very difficult to imagine ourselves in a completely different context.
Yeah, definitely. I had a I had another, he was a YouTuber on. He specializes kind of in going, it's Darkness into Descent is his YouTube channel. But he does a lot around the Holocaust and the Nazi guards in particular. And it's just like, because the thing is, that isn't too long ago. Like, the Vikings, marauding tribes coming attacking. But the Holocaust is what, 80 years ago. But we went into like a lot of the guards and stuff where they would do the most unspeakable, brutal things. And then, but one of them, I can't remember the guy's name. He was a guard, but he just went back and was a milkman.
Sure.
And it's like, it's hard to, and I know there's been a lot of research done on it with the obedience studies and stuff to try understand, but it's so bizarre because that's not long enough ago for to just imagine that level of brutality. But it probably will spike up and then it peters out. Maybe it's not selected for as much. Maybe females aren't as attractive to it. Peace comes, but it's such a strange realm to put yourself in, where that level of violence, brutality, and almost sadism was the norm. Because I think with the what I get from a lot of reading a lot of the stories and stuff on the concentration camps was we almost got to see a microcosm of a world controlled by sadists and psychopaths, and that's that was the output, which is a terrifying almost vision.
Well, I think there's something even more terrifying than that, which is it's not possible for all of the guardsmen and people who are involved in concentration camps to have been sadists or psychopaths.
Yeah,
There simply isn't enough psychopaths in the world. I mean, we think maybe 1% of the population
yeah,
meet whatever rules we set out to say this is what defines somebody as being a psychopath. So, the people who were working in the Nazi death camps, by and large, were just like you and me. They were normal people. They weren't psychopaths. Some possibly were. Certainly, some people ruling in these regimes may well have been psychopaths, but it's the ordinary people who can be brought to do extraordinarily horrific things in spite of not being psychopaths. That's really genuinely terrifying. Um, and it's the fact that otherwise normal people can be brought to do the most horrific, unimaginable things to people on the basis of certain beliefs that they hold.
yeah,
This is what's really scary to me.
yeah. And even in some of the stories you'll read about them guards, it wasn't even so much that they were espousing them beliefs, but it was more so they were more afraid of the social isolation and not going along with it. Where that was almost as egregious as some of the acts they were going to do. If they were, I suppose, sent to the out group, they wouldn't have been the in group. And I think one of the cases I'd read on it where it was during the Nuremberg trials and stuff like that, where they were saying, they weren't able to go on pretty much there was going to be so much shame they would have brought to their family to not go along with it. And that goes into another, I suppose, a huge field of study you have, Phil, around kind of PTSD. And I think we chatted off camera, but one of the areas of interest kind of wanted to pick your brain on this was, so when I think of maybe PTSD, there's maybe a shame and a humiliation, or like, you can have a desperate, event, like maybe you're publicly ashamed. You see a lot of kind of cancel culture. You see a lot of these areas where people go through shame, but on a big scale, not maybe just like in a workplace setting. But then you have the likes of Ukraine war there. I seen you did a lot of research on the PTSD around there, where it's there's a threat to life and it's physical violence and all that. So my question is there different pathways maybe within the PTSD architecture in the brain that will, one is like shame, that kind of more emotional route, humiliation, and the other is an fear of life,
Sure.
threat of violence.
Um, short answer is probably no. So maybe we should just should we define PTSD just
Yeah,
in
yeah,
case anyone isn't quite sure? I'm sure everybody has heard the term and knows what we're talking about, but PTSD is defined, I guess, as a fear-based disorder. It's a condition that can develop after a person experiences an event in their life that's profoundly and extremely threatening or horrific to them. So PTSD comprises a set of symptoms, a set of problems, I suppose. The core symptoms are those flashback experiences, where the person feels as if, and that's a really important word, feels as if the trauma is happening again right here, right now. Right? So, somebody will have experienced a really horrific event, and it's in the past, but they might be cued by something in the external environment. Let's say they've had a car accident and they go back to the same location where the car accident happened. They see something and it triggers this flashback experience. So the memory they get of it is quite unique. It's not like an everyday unpleasant intrusive memory that pops into your mind. I'm sure we all have that where, oh, remember I did that stupid thing or that terrible thing happened 2 years ago, where it's unpleasant, but it's in the past. You're not in danger again. For people who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, when those unpleasant memories pop into mind, they experience it as happening again in the here and now. They feel like they're in danger right now, right here, right? So these kind of flashback experiences are core because these re-experiencing events or reliving events are so unpleasant. People go out of their way to try and avoid any possible reminders that will trigger off that feeling. As I said to somebody, as I say to people, if you can imagine the worst thing that ever happened to you in your life, the worst thing you've ever felt, imagine going through your day where at any moment that could just flash back again to you. Chances are you do an awful lot to try and avoid that.
yeah.
People who experience this then live in a pretty regular state of hyper arousal. They're just always on guard and on watch for something terrible to happen. So PTSD it's a disorder of fear or horror. That's what a trauma is. The term, I suppose, trauma now gets bandied around for any little event.
Yeah.
And, people who go through something minorly unpleasant and difficult tend to talk about it as a trauma. Fine, but that's not, I guess, what the word means in the context of this kind of area. A trauma is defined as any event that provokes extreme fear or extreme horror. So this is usually in the context of a life-threatening event. If somebody literally came up to you, put a gun to your head, and you had every reason in the world to believe that they intended to kill you, pull the trigger and the gun jammed, that would be almost certain to provoke extreme fear and extreme horror in just about anybody, right? So that's what a traumatic event is. Now, I suppose it's interesting to think about what could be a traumatic event. A interpersonal experience where your life isn't objectively threatened could still be perceived to be extremely threatening and extremely horrific. Just take somebody who's having a psychotic episode, who's experiencing an extreme delusion where, let's say insects are crawling into their body and, these very real tactile experiences. This person thinks that their life is in danger. Now, objectively, it's not, but they react as if it is, right? They react with the same level of fear and horror as if their life were actually being threatened, so they can develop PTSD. So this is important because at a biological level, we sort of know what's going on here. When a person has an extreme threat response, certain things happen at the level of the brain. Areas of the brain that encode memory become dysregulated. So parts of the brain that code for all the contextual information, this is where the trauma happened. This is when the trauma happened. This is who was there. This is where they were. That's an area of the brain called the hippocampus. and that gets shut off. We know that gets turned down basically when a person's in an extreme state of stress or fear or horror, right? But I think there's another area of the brain that sits right beside the hippocampus, which is also involved in memory, which is called the amygdala. And this processes, among other things, it processes emotions. So fear, horror, threat, all of these things are processed in the amygdala. Well, that gets ramped up, and that encodes all of the sort of sensory experiences, right? So all the fear and bodily reactions that a person had at that moment. So that's how the memory gets laid down. All the sensory, all the somatic experiences, really, really strong and vivid. But all the contextual information is not there. So that's why if a person's walking around and has experienced a trauma and you say, look, what happened at that time? What did that event involve? A lot of people can have real trouble calling it to mind. And they say, I don't really know. And if I call it to mind, there was a bit of this and there's a bit of that. And it's real disjointed and it's really unusual. And to an outside observer, that can be really strange because you go, well, why can't you remember the details of this incredible event? Something weird must be going on here. But it's just the memory hasn't been laid down in a normal way. But if they're cued, if they see something in the environment that is similar to the event, well, that triggers off the memory, but it triggers off all the feelings, all the experiences. And that's why you have this felt sense that the event is happening again in the here and now. So that biological process of basically turning off the hippocampus and turning up the amygdala and processing the memories in such a way that you feel like it's happening again in the here and now, that can occur under the context of fear and threat and horror.
Yeah.
There's no data we have yet that says that that can happen when a person feels shame and guilt and some of these other emotions, right? So shame and guilt doesn't seem to be a sufficient pathway to trigger off PTSD. Now, that's not to say, so that's just to say that it's probably impossible to have PTSD without fear, without horror. But obviously, shame, guilt, these kind of emotions can co-occur with PTSD and often do for people who experience, very, extreme interpersonal violence. Like I suppose the classic example, a case of sexual assault. Person might feel extreme fear and horror at the moment, and very often people shut down under those cases. We all know the kind of fight or flight response, but it's not fight or flight. It's very often fight, fright, or flight, right? People just shut down. They're just completely overwhelmed. And, a person might not fight back if they're attacked physically, sexually, whatever, And then the person thinks back on that event and goes, well, why did I react that way? Why didn't I try and resist? Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I do these things? And I suppose that can give rise to an awful lot of shame and guilt. So they often co-occur, they often go together, but shame and guilt is probably not enough to give rise to PTSD. It has to be this kind of fear or horror involved in that.
Yeah. And to tie it back to, I have so many questions, by the way, but to tie it back to the first one that's going through my head. So with someone that, say, meets the criterion of psychopathy, and we know they maybe have a downregulated amygdala. So, they're not going to feel like, I don't know whether the jury's out, whether they can feel fear or whether it's not processed different. But in an individual like that, are they able to experience PTSD if they don't really feel fear, and they're not going to get that, amygdala activity kind of overload that you'd experience maybe if you are experiencing PTSD? Are they more, I don't want to say immune, but I'm probably struggling here for a better word, but are they,
No,
are
you're on there,
they,
Jack.
yeah, are they immune from PTSD, would you
They're
say?
much less likely. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we know one of the key features of psychopathy is really blunted emotional life. They don't experience much anxiety. They don't experience much sadness or depression or all of these things that, most non-psychopathic people feel on a regular basis. Yeah, it just, it takes a hell of a lot more to distress a person who experiences psychopathy. So I suppose a classic example of this is um gosh, main names I always forget. The Iceman, Richard
Oh yeah,
Kuklinski.
Richard
Richard
Kuklinski. Yeah.
Kuklinski. So he's kind of an interesting guy to study. He's done a lot of interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists. Well, he did when he was in prison. But he recounts a story of some of his victims. He killed them. If he was asked to really make it unpleasant, he would drag these people out, tie them up, leave them in a cave, cut wounds in their arms and legs, and let the rats go at them. And he'd set up a video camera and record it so could give it to his clients who employed him. But he would watch these videos. And he said they'd be out there, these victims would be out there for quite a while. There would be a lot of screaming, there would be a lot of thrashing, and eventually the rats would kill them and the screaming would stop. And he would talk about these things, and the psychiatrist asked him, "Well, how did you feel when you watch these things?" Because most normal people would be sickened by it; they would literally have a visceral reaction. And he said, "Well, I'd feel something. My heart would go a little bit, and I didn't know what it was, and that was curious and that was interesting. So I did it again, and I did it again, right?" So these people are capable of experiencing fear, horror, distress. It's just their threshold for experiencing these things is set so high that, yeah, they are much less likely to experience anxiety and fear-based reactions. They absolutely are. But I suppose it cuts both ways. This is back to your original question, like, why did it evolve? Because under some circumstances, psychopathy can be incredibly beneficial. The features of psychopathy can be positive and adaptive. And we know people who are highly psychopathic, can do occupations like being in the police or being in the fire service or being in the military, and there a certain degree of fearlessness can be really helpful. Why does somebody charge a hill and try and take an elevated position? Or why does somebody run into a burning building and try and rescue people even if it puts their life in danger? They're not paralyzed by fear. So yeah, one of the more depressing findings, I think, in psychology in general is that people who are more agreeable, who are, basically, not to put too fine a point on it, but people who are really nice, caring, and empathic, and agreeable, they're much more likely to develop problems like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. They have that kind of highly reactive, emotional life that does make them more vulnerable to these conditions.
Yeah, and it would make sense as well. And I suppose that even goes back to my next question. So, if you have, I suppose, psychopathy at one end of the spectrum, and will probably have a blunted kind of PTSD response, is there? If we look at the other end of the spectrum, is there anything that will maybe, I suppose, correlate with if someone's more likely to experience it? So is there kind of studies done on that route? Is there a certain set of maybe personality traits or any sort of traits that will make me more susceptible to experiencing PTSD?
Yes, I suppose the big one is this personality trait, this overarching personality trait that we call neuroticism or emotional stability. And the neurotic personality trait, I guess you can think of a personality trait as this sort of continuum, as this line, right? As this, and it follows a normal distribution, a bit of a bell curve. At most people are somewhere in between, but there are a small fraction of people at an extreme end, let's say the right tail, who are very what we call neurotic or emotionally unstable. And these are people who just find it remarkably easy to have an anxious response, to have to feeling down. These are people who are, we know, very, very vulnerable to developing all kinds of emotional based disorders. Whereas at the other end, on the left tail of the distribution, are people who are very low in neuroticism or very highly emotionally stable, where, things don't push them around. They experience losses and they're fine. They don't develop anxiety or depression. These are, in some sense, very, very lucky people, you know. Um, these are these are kind of people who you'll often hear it said that sort of no matter what happens in their life, they just don't really feel that down. They just don't really feel that anxious about things. Here, listen, you have to get up and make a talk in front of 1,000 people on a topic you've never talked about now in 15 minutes. Some people just react to that and go, grand, yeah, no problem, I'll do it. You know, most people will react with some fear and some anxiety to that. And then there's a small group of people who'll be petrified, who'll be utterly and completely terrified by it. So yeah, people vary in the extent to which they have these emotional reactions.
Yeah, there's going to be variance across all subsets of personality traits and people. Uh, and I suppose that's probably the role of the psychologist, is trying to, figure out how all these different parts intersect.
Variance is the psychologist's greatest friend. That's what we always try and do. Like, we try and understand variability, you know, to what extent does it exist? And then we try and explain it. Why do some people fall on the low end of psychopathy is essentially a personality trait. We all fall somewhere on this dimension of psychopathy. We all, to some extent, have features of psychopathy. So if you think about it like a dimmer switch, like when it's turned all the way up and the room is super bright and you can barely see. I mean, that's your sort of Richard Kuklinski type person. you know, Turn it all the way down where it's, virtually no features. I don't know, that's like the nicest person who's ever lived, probably. But we all fall somewhere probably between those two extremes. We have some features and not others. And, what we want to try and do as psychologists is describe that variability and then try and explain it. Why are some people high? Why are some people low? Why do people vary along? And I suppose ultimately by explaining it, by understanding those mechanisms, it allows us to intervene and allows us to manipulate them, and hopefully for the better, and try and help people who are suffering.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose that goes on, segues into, I suppose, the next point, where I'd seen a lot of your research, of your recent research, was looking at maybe the effect of the pandemic and this kind of social jet lag I'd seen and stuff like that. So from your studies, like the impact on it from a psychological lens, like what have you seen? What has what's the, I suppose, findings coming out now, of the effect, of the pandemic?
Sure, yeah. So I was lucky enough to be involved in a very big study. It was coordinated by a guy over in England, Richard Bentel, fabulous psychologist over there. And really, in no time, I mean, we knew the sort of pandemic was going. Remember, if you think back to it in those kind of early days of 2020, we sort of knew in February, oh, first cases are arriving, it's coming. And, basically, Richard put together this massive project in the UK, trying to basically say, okay, can we observe and look at what's happening to people during the pandemic? What's this going to do? So we set up a big, what we call a longitudinal study to try and track people. And I was lucky enough to get involved in the Irish study and to try and kind of co-lead that with a couple of other folks over here. So I suppose our interest, we had lots of people working on the project, political psychologists trying to understand, well, how are people's political views changing through this? I guess we had social psychologists involved. And I mean, my main area of research was mental health. It was trying to understand, how did people's mental health change across the pandemic, and it was an interesting time, because, if you think back to it, there was an awful lot of people. I suppose the term that kept being thrown around at that time was that there's going to be a tsunami of mental health problems. This was going to cause people to be totally thrown off and destroyed. And one of the nice things about studying trauma is what you learn is that human beings are unbelievably resilient. I
Yeah.
mean, the vast majority of people who are affected by these traumatic events that we've discussed are absolutely fine. It's only a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of people who, when they encounter a horrific traumatic event, are really disturbed by it. So human beings are unbelievably resilient. We also know from that when trauma occurs in a social context to many people at the same time, people are even more resilient because the biggest sort of protective factor for people after trauma is having nice people around them to give them support. So if you're going through something together with somebody, if you've somebody to lean on, that helps, right? So we heard all this stuff around tsunami and mental health problems, and we were kind of thinking, well, probably not, you know. But hey, let's look, you know, you can see it both ways. So anyway, we were able to track the Irish population for the first year. Like we started doing assessments, you know, the first week of lockdown, we tracked people, you know, under a number of occasions across the first year. In the UK, we're actually still going. I mean, what's this, like 4 years later? But it's not just
Okay.
us. There was an explosion of research all over the world, people everywhere doing this. So we're drowning in data. And basically, the gist is from a mental health perspective, COVID had basically zero effect on people's mental health.
Wow. And like, I think that's such an interesting finding because I think there's probably it's counterintuitive nearly. I think there was so much maybe rhetoric around, people are going to be, the social isolation and all. People are going to go, crazy for want of a better word. But I think it probably goes back to, you mentioned the word there that it all ties back into, which is resilience. And I think, and what is that like? If you like, so we're saying resilience is a word. Does it map somewhere in the brain? Does it map to some sort of behavior that strengthens it or weakens it, or is it just like a pretty much inbuilt protective mechanism that most people are born with?
Yeah. So resilience is is a subject that a lot of psychologists focus on now and discuss, and I find it sometimes a bit irritating because I think resilience is just a description. It just
Yeah.
means that people are unmoved in some sense, are able to deal with hardships and adversities and difficulties. So for me, you haven't explained anything when you've said somebody is resilient. You simply just described what's going on. And then to me, the interesting question is, well, why are they resilient? What are these things that make people resilient? So I mean, if you think back to the pandemic, this is a bit of an example. I mean, we were very lucky, I suppose, to go through the pandemic in Ireland. And okay, some people, I don't mean to downplay this in any way, shape, or form, because some people, literally some people died, had loved ones who died as a result of COVID. Some people had their lives ruined, absolutely ruined. Their businesses were killed, you know, you name it. I'm not in any way, shape, or form downplaying the effect that it had. But for most people on a population average level, life in Ireland during the pandemic probably wasn't that bad. You know, many people could continue to work from home, you know, so their income stream remained constant. We did this because we asked a lot of people about changes in their life, and lots of people reported improvements in their life. Oh, look, I don't have to commute for 4 hours a day. Isn't this great? Now I get to spend more time, you know, with my loved ones. Suddenly you're locked in to your house for a few weeks on end with the people you care about the most in the world. Oh, isn't that nice, you know? Um, you know, people can reconnect, friends can reconnect. For all the bad things you can say about the government and the state and all that kind of stuff, you know, people were sent money and were, you know, essentially given given protection, you know. So there was a lot about the pandemic that helped to make people resilient, right? Under under different circumstances at a different time in a different place, you know, the pandemic could have been really catastrophic. Imagine if people had lost their jobs and were told, okay, that's it, lots of luck, you know, we're not going to help you with your mortgage or your rent, we're not going to give you any money, so good luck, grow your own food, I guess. You know, this could then be hugely terrifying for most of us, for a lot of us. the most annoying thing was we kind of had to watch another series on Netflix and not go out. And for a lot of people, that's not too bad. And that actually, when we looked into it, when I say the mental health effect was pretty much zero, and that's really true at an average level. There was no real increase or anything like that in mental health problems. But if you zero into it, some people, their mental health really declined. About 10% of people had a real decline in their mental health. Their anxiety went up, their depression went up, all that kind of stuff. These people really suffered. But then there was another side. There was about 10% of people whose mental health got way better, who were anxious, who were depressed, who were suffering, who really adjusted and their lives improved as a result of the pandemic. So they kind of cancelled each other out, you know what I mean?
And Phil, with that, could it be maybe that the extreme end of introversion enjoyed it, and the extreme end of maybe extroversion, they were allergic to it nearly. It was an allergic reaction.
For sure. The environment, it's a sort of environment personality match. If you're extremely extroverted, and there's actually some interesting stuff on this. We know that sort of people who are extremely extroverted tend to gravitate and live more in kind of really densely populated urban environments, right? That happens as well. So if you think about it, if you're an extremely extroverted person, you're living in a city, your whole life is built around and you enjoy it in terms of going out all the time, meeting people, congregating, doing all of these kinds of things, and suddenly you're told, nope, none of that, social isolation, you can't go to work, you can't go out partying, you can't do any of that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean that's going to affect you, but I mean it's probably not enough to send anyone into a depression or into an anxious period. But it will probably just mean that if you ask them, how good is your life right now compared to last month, they'll probably go, not so good, don't like it. But vice versa, obviously people who are highly introverted, who are forced because of the conditions of their life to go out and to be around people all the time and to interact and do all of these things that they find challenging and tiring and difficult. Now suddenly the world is constructed in such a way that they can stay home. They're not constantly interacting with people or out in these kind of busy environments. Suddenly you ask them and they'll probably go, gee, yeah, I like my life right now. This is kind of nice. I could get used to this,
Yeah.
So yeah, people will vary. As we said before, some people will be a better fit to their environment, but it's much more likely that the kind of people who are thrown into a depression and anxiety, these are the people I just described. These are the people whose lives are really upended by the changes. Um, so what makes people resilient? Well, it's a whole combination of things. Partly it's genes. Let's say people who are on that lucky end, of the emotional stability index. Bad things happen, but hey, sure, look, they just tend to look on the bright side of things. They tend to have the kind of brain that doesn't react to stress and give rise to these kind of anxious and depressed feelings. But there are environmental things as well. People who have, let's say you were locked down and you had your family around you. I mean, it's huge. Versus being locked down and maybe you're living in a different country and your family was abroad and all that kind of stuff. Um, you know, Personal experience, I was very lucky when we could only go that sort of 2 kilometers. I was lucky enough to live in a part of Ireland where there's a beach and a forest and all of these kind of things, a park that you could go walking in. I used to think, like, imagine somebody who's living in the center of town where everything was shut down and they couldn't kind of go anywhere nice for a walk or anything like that.
And
That
no
must
maybe
be,
amenities and
yeah,
or the likes of nature kind of that you just described there, being able to go for a walk and stuff. So
exactly. So, what makes people resilient? It's a whole combination of biological, psychological, social, interpersonal things. And for me, just describing the person as, you are the kind of person who's resilient, fine, but it doesn't tell me anything about, well, why are they resilient,
yeah,
I guess to me that's the interesting thing is understanding that in the context of whatever you want to discuss, whether it's
yeah,
depression, anxiety, PTSD, psychopathy, you name it.
yeah.
Why are some people more or less likely to get these things?
And Phil, here's one for you. So if I want to get stronger, just say I want to get better leg strength. I can go into the gym and I can do a bunch of squats or deadlifts. I want to get fitter. I can go out for a run. I can go, even walking, depending on what it is. Is from what you've seen, is resilience something you can train per se, like you could with cardiovascular fitness, strength training? Is it something that you can actively train?
For sure. Yeah,
Okay.
100%. Maybe I'll caveat that by saying, yeah, for some things, let's say if you wanted to be resilient to anxiety and depression, for example, yeah, there's things you can do to become more resilient. We know, just as one example, negative thinking, negative patterns of thinking, negative beliefs about the self, others, in the world. These are central to the onset of depression, anxiety. Our treatments, our best psychological treatments for anxiety and depression are things is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which basically tries to change how people think. I mean, people can change their minds. They can change how they think. So you can invest time in spotting these kind of cognitive or thinking errors and doing something about it. We know certain things that boost it, like as I said, one of the biggest protective factors and risk factors for anxiety and depression is all around social support. So investing time in building relationships, building good relationships with other people, that's huge, having a meaningful thing in life, something in life that you find meaningful, a long-term pursuit or a goal. These things are hugely beneficial to people's mental health. So you can, yeah, you can change an awful lot of things in your life, in the most general sense, that do ultimately make you more or less resilient. Sleep, oh my God, sleep is unbelievably important for your mental health. Probably almost certainly plays a very large causal role in many mental health problems. You can take control of your sleep. You can set good practices in what we call good sleep hygiene. That's incredibly important. Exercise, man. I mean, there's just work being published, big reviews just being published that shows that exercise is at least as effective as our best treatments, psychotherapeutic and pharmacological treatments for depression and anxiety. Get out 40 minutes of exercise 3, 4 times a week, whether it's cardio or, weight training, whatever. I mean, hugely important.
And Phil, did he understand what the pathway is there? So you'd mentioned there that the psychologist's job is trying to maybe understand why as well. Did he understand? Is it the dopamine or the serotonin release? Is it rewiring the brain's plasticity? What's going on there? Why is it, or is it just that we evolved moving and we live in you know, pretty much a far more sedentary world, and movement is maybe more essential than we think for not only physical well-being but mental.
Yeah, I mean, do we understand it? Not totally, but we don't know nothing either,
Yeah.
right? So no, we probably, no, we certainly don't have a good biological model of depression that allows us to, definitively say this is why it develops. But we know something. We really do know something. And we know something about what happens at the level of the brain when people engage in regular exercise. And, you can track people over time. You can take people who are depressed and you can look at what's going on inside their brain, and then you can set them, therapeutic interventions, be that psychotherapy or, exercise interventions or a combination of both, or pharmacological interventions. And we can just track these people as they go through these interventions, treatments, whatever you want to call them, and see what's happening at the level of the brain as they go through these treatments. And we can see areas of the brain start to wake up essentially and become more active, and new connections developing between neurons. And we can model it all down to that level of detail, and gene expression and all of these kind of amazing things. Um, why exactly it works, we don't know. That it works, we know. You know. Um, so yeah, you want to make yourself more resilient to depression and anxiety. Just as one example, sleep better, train more. It's not the whole story. It's by interact more with people, develop good relationships with people, think more clearly. Um, it sounds easy, sounds simple. It's not really, really difficult, really hard. But yeah, we know some things that do work. We don't have the total picture, but we know something.
I think it's a very exciting time. I think when like that level of research is going on into exercise, because I think anyone that's worked out consistently throughout their life know that the benefits are just so obvious to a consistent exercise program. I have that Whoop strap now, and since I've got it, like it's really helped fine tune my sleep schedule. But like you can really see, like not only can you'll wake up the next day, okay, I had a really good sleep, but you can actually see the physiological benefit, which are heart rate variability or your rest and heart rate and all that. So I think it's a really exciting time, probably in psychology, and probably from a physical aspect, that we're linking up the effect of the positive effect of exercise on on mental well-being, because I think it's been obvious to I think a lot of people that did exercise. So where is that research going to go, do you think? Like, will it get to the stage where maybe instead of a doctor or a psychiatrist, maybe you know maybe going, okay, here's an SSRI, we're going to give you pharmacological treatment. Do you think maybe the first step, unless it's severe, will be, okay, here's exercise? Or do you think it'll get like that?
It's already there. It's already exercise is already being prescribed as an intervention for depression. Um, I mean, I could be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure there are international bodies that review the scientific literature and inform the public and professionals, right? What are the sort of evidence based or empirically supported treatments for condition X, right? So one example of this is, the one I always go to, I think is great, is in the UK they have what are called the NICE guidelines, NICE guidelines. So if anyone out there is ever interested in what do you do to treat any condition, physical, mental, if you ever just look up the NICE guidelines for that condition, you'll see it's a phenomenal resource. Um, so I'm pretty certain, I'm almost certain, that physical exercise is regarded by these kinds of organizations or bodies as an empirically supported treatment for depression. So many, 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 many psychologists, psychiatrists will prescribe, quote unquote, prescribe exercise as an intervention for depression. And I suppose a lot of people talk nowadays about like personalized medicine, personalized psychotherapy. Matching the individual to the appropriate treatment. I mean, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but my understanding is that when a patient comes in, therapist, doctor might try a lot of different things. We know that a combination of psychotherapy and medication tends to produce better results from more people than either one alone. So presumably between the doctor and the person, there will be some consultation and, well, what can we do? What's the person most likely to engage in? And we try our best. And I guess the really exciting thing is just exercise offers a free, effective, widely available intervention for these really crippling problems. I mean, depression is depression is one of the leading causes of what we call years lost to disability, just a way of estimating the impact of a given disease. Again, I use that term in quotes, on people's lives. And depression is like among the most leading ones, and it's only growing because people live with it for many, 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 many years. They develop it early in life. It can be chronic. It affects a lot of people, and here we have this incredibly effective treatment that's available to everybody, free of charge. And, as I said, the exercise, we know it can be anything. It doesn't matter, anaerobic, aerobic. It really doesn't matter the kind of exercise you do. Once a person gets up and moves and gets their heart rate going at a certain level, it's 40 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week. That's the effectiveness of it. So to me, it's cool. Where will it go in the future? I don't know, but just to know that we have a treatment like that available is really encouraging. But I think more fundamentally, it says something about what we need to be resilient again, and what we need to live, hopefully, healthy lives, both physically and mentally, psychologically. You know, regular continual exercise seems to be, the data, the evidence would show, seems to be a really important component for most people. Now, I don't doubt, this is back to our kind of variance. Of course, you're going to find people who don't move don't burn a calorie by moving, and will be as happy as Larry and will not
Yeah.
experience anxiety and depression. Sure, there's going to be some people like that. And then the other side, you're going to find people who can exercise, can run a marathon every day of the week, and won't get a boost in their mood. Sure. But for most people, most of the time, you will see a positive effect.
And yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think some of the other interesting research I'd looked at lately was, I think a lot's kind of coming out of Canada and the US as well, which is looking at, say, with like PTSD, which we discussed earlier, but the likes of psilocybin and ketamine, which I think when I was growing up, like these drugs would have been described as, the worst things in the world. It'll make you hallucinate or it'll do that. But it's so strange to see now this paradigm shift where these are becoming viable, well, any of the early research looks at viable mechanisms to treat, like, you know mental difficulty or mental disorders. I suppose, where did that come out of, do you think? Or what's, like, was it just shut off because of the, we had in the 60s, maybe the, what was it, reefer madness or whatever, that it just became so stigmatized they kept away from it? Or what's the resurgence? Any thoughts on that, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this history. I mean, I do believe, where did it come from? Well, I think there was sort of pioneering research in the sort of 1950s that showed that psychedelics could have these beneficial effects for people when used in a therapeutic context. I think some of the sort of pioneers on that were a bit, uh, you know, skirted ethical rules or maybe some legal codes, and that caused some problems. And I think, obviously tied with sort of social problems and legalization rules around drugs, it just got, that whole area of research got tamped down. It didn't go anywhere. But look, if something is true, if something works, it will eventually get found. The truth has a way of getting out, right? Um, so I guess sooner or later, people rediscover this work, start doing the work, find that, oh, look at this. If we use these compounds, these drugs in a particular way, they can be incredibly helpful for some people. Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Like, you're right. The early research is incredibly exciting for things like MDMA in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, psilocybin, ketamine in the treatment of depression. Some of the chronic treatment-resistant depression. It looks good, but you know, large-scale randomized clinical trials, as conclusively as we can, demonstrating that they're safe and effective. I'm not sure it's quite there yet, but it's really, really exciting. It's great. I mean, one thing I have noticed that I think is kind of strange. It's just an observation. Is you'll very often meet people who don't like the idea of, say, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, modern class of antidepressants for treating depression. It's like, come on, let's get up and let's work and let's, go exercising or do psychotherapy. All this stuff is good. Taking drugs for depression, not great. But then a lot of these people will be really fascinated and really sort of engaged by the notion of using psychedelics. Don't get it. For me, it's just like, if something works for a horrible condition like depression or crippling anxiety, be it a drug, a psychotherapy, a behavioral intervention like exercise, bring it on. The more of these treatments we have, the better. Um, so yeah, I read that research with excitement when I get alerts and it's like, phase 3 clinical trial shows, MDMA effective in helping to treat PTSD. I always click on them. I always read them. I think it's amazing.
And I suppose to go back to the evolutionary perspective as well, Phil, do you think there's an evolutionary aspect to PTSD? Like, I can understand about anxiety. It's a very adaptive behavior. I think something, obviously, when someone has chronic anxiety, it's maladaptive, and that's, it's kind of grown into a maladaptive way. But with depression and PTSD are kind of ones I find harder to trace, maybe the evolutionary journey of them symptoms. And maybe to start off with PTSD, do you think there's an evolutionary benefit, or there could have been, and maybe modernity's environment is skewed it?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. And as much as I'm as big of a fan of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary perspectives as you will ever get. I'm not one of these people who's down on evolutionary psychology. Um, I don't know, and I'm not entirely convinced that. I was going to say I'm not entirely convinced it's a useful way to think about these things, but again, if it's true, then it is a useful way to think about it. So I can see a way in which a tendency to you encounter this life-threatening event. You walk out of your cave, you hear a rustling in the bushes, and a tiger jumps out and tries to eat you and kill you, and by a stroke of luck you survive. You get away, right? I can see a way in which learning, oh my god, I nearly died, don't do that again, be on alert for that, avoid, 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 could confer some advantage. So but again, I wouldn't like to say that PTSD has been selected for. I'd be thinking more about, well, look how memory operates. Look how, why do we remember things like in this way? I'd be more back to that. I'd be more back to thinking at a fundamental level, memory operates in a very particular way which benefited our survival. One of the outcomes of that very useful psychological adaptation is a tendency towards this disorder developing, right? And I guess one thing worth keeping in mind is that evolution really doesn't care. Evolution, if you can imagine a natural selection-eyed view of things, it doesn't care if we're happy, contented, and at ease at all times. It couldn't care less. If you're surviving and reproducing while being riddled with anxiety, that's far better than being calm, serene, content, and deliriously happy and not reproducing, right? Surviving and reproducing. So, if you, yeah, I personally don't, I've never heard a convincing argument why depression would be selected for in some case. In that specific case of depression, it's a horrible disease. It increases your risk of death by suicide. So that seems the complete antithesis to
Exactly.
selection
Yeah.
pressure. What you'd also have to demonstrate, I guess, if one were to make an argument that PTSD has been selected for, if depression has been selected for, is that the individuals that possess the genes that give rise to these traits out out reproduce individuals without those traits, right? So you have to be able to show a sort of tendency to increase survival and reproduction rates. Well, otherwise, you can't make an argument that these things have been selected for. And I see no evidence. I mean, even and depression is one that's got a lot of attention. Can depression be adaptive? Has it been selected? I've yet to ever see anyone provide conclusive evidence, and it should be there. The evidence will be there. It's in principle identifiable. I've never seen anyone produce a body of evidence that shows, people with depression are more likely to survive and reproduce than people not prone to depression. And in fact, all the evidence seems to go the other way. So I think we survive, in spite of it, not because of it. Um, and yeah, I think you're much better off looking at much more basic psychological traits and dispositions that do confer a survival advantage or a reproductive advantage under most circumstances, which can, under extreme and unpleasant, situations, give rise to these experiences that we put a label on and call depression.
And that's it. I think you really hit the nail on the head there. We categorize, we put words and names on it, we categorize stuff. But again, it's like evolution or like all these happen at such a scale. It doesn't care about the word we care, the semantics behind what we, I suppose, classify something as a set of behaviors or a set of symptoms, etc.
Exactly, exactly. It's just something like rumination, which is very, very common in depression. I mean, this is a universal feature we all have. We all tend to ruminate in certain circumstances. You can imagine easily. I can imagine a circumstance in which having that psychological tendency or disposition is extremely beneficial, right? The genes that produced that psychological trait are more likely to be selected for and increased in frequency. Um, but under certain conditions, you lose everything. Your whole family is eaten by the tiger, and now you're on your own. Okay, that's terrible circumstances. This is where then that psychological trait that under most circumstances can be beneficial can give rise to extreme distress. You just think over and over, why did it happen? Why did it have to be my family that got eaten by the tiger? Why couldn't it be the other family in the other cave across the road? Um, so these are just unfortunate outcrops of psychological dispositions and tendencies we have that usually confer survival and reproductive advantage.
Anything, I suppose, any topics or area research field that has you really excited, say, over this decade, say, is there anywhere that's, really caught your fancy or that you're really intrigued by and you think it'll have maybe a big impact on psychology as a discipline?
Well, psychology as a discipline is such a broad field. It's one of the great things about studying psychology, which is that, like, it goes from studying what happens at the level of brains, whether in humans or in other animals, incredibly, objective and, I suppose rigorously scientific, all the way over to really sort of esoteric, unusual, maybe less than, you know, rigorously scientific fields. I won't name any. Um, for me, I guess my interest lies generally in the area of mental health. So I suppose that's one area I'm super interested in. Um, for me, the most exciting thing is, it's back to what I said earlier. I think our job is to describe, to understand and describe, you know. And right now, I mean, it's obvious to anyone who looks that people can suffer and do suffer. They experience mental health distress. What is the appropriate way to describe that? We're all very familiar with what's generally called the standard psychiatric model of distress, which is this idea that, all of that distress that we see in the world can be best described in terms of a small set of, well, not so much a small, but in terms of a set of discrete diseases, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, post traumatic stress disorder. So the idea is that, all of these disorders exist, that they are ultimately diseases. There's an underlying biological process that gives rise to them. And that's the kind of standard psychiatric model of distress, that's been pretty unsuccessful. It's been successful. It's led to great advances and great developments in our understanding of psychological distress. But we all sort of know it's not true. Everyone kind of knows in the field it's not. That's not the perfect or optimal description of psychiatric distress. Within clinical psychology, there are new and emerging ways of describing distress that are built on an empirical foundation. Our standard psychiatric model was built on clinical observations. Literally clinicians working with patients just saw clusters of experiences and said, this is a disorder. So it was observed. It wasn't built from the ground up on the basis of empirical evidence. We now have these emerging models. It's what's called a quantitative model of psychopathology that I think is incredibly exciting. I think, if we're better able to describe and understand what psychological distress is, then we can understand the causal mechanisms involved. We can make these breakthroughs. We can make these discoveries. So, there's been a whole line of research over decades and decades and millions and millions and millions of euros and dollars spent to say, like, for example, what is the genetic basis of major depressive disorder? That's only a sensible question if there's such a thing as major depressive disorder.
Right.
Right. And so our efforts to identify a causal mechanism on this phenomenon, is only as worthwhile as our descriptions. Now, if our description is wrong, if there isn't such a thing as major depressive disorder, then trying to look for the genetic basis of it, for example, is going to be futile. You're not going to find it. But if we have a more accurate description of psychopathology in general, then, if we get that right and we start saying then, okay, well, what causes this and what causes the development of all these conditions, then we're going to be on much firmer ground. So in clinical psychology, there actually is quite a big revolution going on at the moment in our understanding and our description of psychological distress. So I suppose I don't want anyone to take the wrong message from what I'm saying. It's not that people aren't depressed. Of course they are. Of course people suffer depression. But how best do we describe what we observe in the world in terms of psychological distress? That's actually undergoing quite a revolution in clinical psychology. So it's a bit nerdy, I guess. Sorry, I'm really not explaining this particularly well. But if anyone's interested, you could look up something called HITOP, HITOP. If you just Google HITOP and put something like mental health in there, you'll find a really beautiful description of it online. It's easier to see than just to describe. Drop in HITOP mental health as opposed to just HITOP to avoid the shoes. But yeah, that to me, that's kind of my major area of interest at the moment.
And that's advancing along. And Phil, is that an almost a process where it's clinical observance kind of fused with quantitative research, kind of to get a more holistic view or a more accurate review of what these maybe mental health symptoms are, or if we have the right definition of it, the right set of symptomology?
Essentially, yeah. I'll give you by analogy. I'll try and explain it. So one of the psychology's crown and glories, if you had to point to psychology and go, what's the sort of best area of research in psychology? Maybe folks have heard of the replication crisis in science, findings not replicate. There's some areas of psychology that are just terrible in terms of producing replicable findings. So, for example, there's a whole line of research called priming, which is this idea that, like, you see all these studies of saying, well, hold a cup in your hand, and if you're holding a warm cup in your hand, you're more likely to make warm evaluations of the person you're talking to. Total nonsense, total garbage. Didn't replicate. No surprise that sort of stuff didn't replicate. One of the areas where findings replicate over and over and over and over and over again, and it's just incredible, is in the area of what we call personality and individual differences. So if you want to understand the basic building blocks of humans, on the fundamental bases on which we vary, back to that again, you know, so personality traits and intelligence are the things that psychologists could hold up as saying, like, this is why our field is worthwhile. This is how rigorous it is. So if I said, then what are the basic personality traits on which we all vary? We know that there are at least five. There might be six. There are at least five basic personality traits on which we all vary. They're called openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So these are a bit like we were talking about before. They're all dimensions. They're like dimmer switches. They can be turned up or turned down, and we all fall somewhere along each of these dimensions. And how do we get there? How do we know that there are these five basic personality traits? Lots of theorists came along and said, well, I think there are two. And others came along and said, I think there are 16, and this and that. People just observed the world and wrote up their observations and claimed, here's my theory, let's go out and test it. And they turned out to be wrong, and they turned out to be wrong, and they turned out to be wrong, and they turned out to be wrong. And eventually, a couple of researchers said, do you know what? What if we just admit our ignorance and say we have absolutely no idea how many personality traits there are, but we just take all of this massive amount of data that we have, and we let the data tell us how many basic personality traits there are. So this is an exploratory method. Basically, you jam all this data into a computer, you run this statistical analysis, and basically what comes out, the big signal that came out of all that data was, there seems to be these big five massive traits that subsume everything. And then you look at it and you go, oh, that looks like people who are open to new experiences, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So rather than us observing things like 10 patients in a clinic and saying, oh, I think I know the exact description of mental disorder in the population, what this new high top model is doing, what this new revolution is doing, is it's kind of saying, look, we don't really know how many disorders they are, what these disorders are. What if we just take the abundance of evidence we have and we allow the data to tell us what exists, And what emerges from the empirical evidence, from the data itself, is a very, very different picture of psychological pathology, psychopathology, than what we've generally been working under. So I see this, if you had tapped any psychologist on the shoulder in 1970 and said, how many fundamental personality traits are there? They would have told you, the best science tells us there are 16. Absolutely, 100%. In 2024 and long before 2024, by the 1990s, we knew that was definitively wrong. It was not the case, Now, tap somebody on the shoulder 20 years from now, hopefully we'll know more, because then our science is advancing. But we could be pretty damn confident there are at least these big five personality traits. I have a feeling we're standing right at that moment in clinical psychology where you tap most people on the shoulder and say, what's our best description? What's our best model theory description of psychological distress that we see around the world? Most people will go, don't know, not sure. The model we have now, our standard model, doesn't work. And actually, we know it doesn't work. Actually, everybody knows it doesn't work because, for example, in America, you have this thing called the National Institutes of Mental Health. They're the largest funder of all public research. They basically said, right, no more funding using the standard model of psychiatric distress. We've given you 100 years, 60 years, you've made no real progress, so that's it, we're done. Where we're going to be 10 years from now is really interesting. It's really exciting because we don't really know, but I really get the sense we're moving in the right direction. And I think, you studied psychology, maybe 2017, 2018, around that sort of time, right?
2016, 2017, around there, yeah. So
yeah, I have a feeling, and I would have taught you an abnormal psychology class, and I would have given you what the best textbook definition is of psychopathology and how we understand it. I have absolutely no doubt that you teach the same class 10, 20 years from now, it would be very, very different. Very different. You
So
know.
there is that paradigm shift is on
I,
the horizon.
yeah, I think so. And it's, you can, this is what's so interesting about science is it's a process of discovery. I think we are discovering better and more accurate ways of describing the world. That's one of our jobs as psychologists. Then, or scientists, as psychological scientists. Then the second job after you've described it is to be able to predict and explain it. So I can
Yeah,
describe the world as it is. Now I can explain why it's happening, what's going on, what's working. And once you get the description and the explanation work down and figure it out as best you can, then it's manipulation, then it's intervention.
yeah,
Then we can figure out, well, we know what it is, we know why it's happening. Therefore, we know where and how and why to intervene and help people. So, this will happen at different levels. This will happen at the level of the brain, which is great, all the kind of neuroscientific work. It will happen at the level of the mind, all the psychological work. That's great. We can see all these different treatments emerging and developing at different paces, talked about a couple, physical exercise, psychedelics, things like this, new drug developments, new psychotherapies. All of this will build to a better and better and better understanding of why people suffer, what it is, why people suffer, and therefore how to intervene. So, for me, I'm really bullish on psychology. There's a lot of people who, even in the field and outside the field, who are real bearish on psychology and think, not so good. I'm not there at all. Psychology is such a good story to tell, and probably not enough good storytellers, who are telling the amazing discoveries that are being made and discoveries that will ultimately lead to, hopefully improvements in people's lives, because it's what we do. We study memory. We understand memory and what goes on at the level of the brain in terms of memory, for example. I mean, as we continue to live longer and longer and longer, cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, these are all conditions that afflict people. It will be psychology that solves this problem. So it's in so many different areas. We there's a lot of good stuff happening in psychology that can be good for society, good for people.
yeah. And I think even I think it's a fascinating lens to view the world. I think people come from all sorts of angles to try and understand nature, whether it's theology, if it's physics, if it's philosophy. But I think psychology is a very it's always fascinated me, and I think it's a fascinating way to view the world.
You know,
And
I think if you take it back even to what we started discussing earlier in terms of crime, psychopathy, yeah, I think we're gonna. I really think psychology has an enormous amount to say about why people behave in these antisocial, criminalistic ways. If we understand that, we will have better and better ways to intervene and try and change people's behaviors. We already have loads of interventions that are good at reducing crime. And I think it will have profound effects on our criminal justice system, on how we regard and view criminals and what we do with criminals. So it's it's the thing that gets me up in the morning. It's the thing that excites me. I mean, I can't wait. If I had a time machine, I'd always jump into the future, and I'd be fascinated to see, where we are in 50 years, as a result of psychology's contributions.
yeah, and I think that's the fun thing about science is it's constantly evolving, and it's constantly what's next, and you know looking at the past and rewriting. Sorry, my cat now is after jumping up. So
Right, you're a very lucky man. I wish, I'm a cat person, not a dog person. I wish I had a cat in here, but my missus is allergic to
yeah,
cats, so
yeah, no,
I can
that's
only
it.
enjoy them from afar.
Yeah, that's it. They're a handful anyway. Well, she is. But Phil, I think on that note, man, I think we covered a lot today. I'm already thinking that I'm hoping you'll come back again and we'll go down another few avenues and get deep into the weeds again with it. Yeah, I think you have a fascinating repertoire of knowledge there, and I know from in all my lectures, I really looked forward going to your classes. You have a really deep understanding, so it's lovely to hear in a nice long form where we can kind of, you can elaborate on theories or on research. So I just want to say thanks so much. And yeah, I hope you'll come back.
I will indeed, Gary. It's been a pleasure. It's been great to talk to you. I appreciate the kind words. And it's just as I said to you before we started rolling, it's so cool to see you doing so well. It's so great to, I remember I was trying to talk to you about doing a PhD and you were having none of it. It was, you're going to be an author, you're going to write, you're going to do this, and to see you now fulfilling it and publish your first novel, I think, more on the way, I'm sure, and everything else you're branching out into. It's so nice. It's so cool. It's been really fun talking to you about this. Yeah, let's do it again, and hopefully, more to say.
Definitely, and also thank you for them kind words, Phil. I think when I'd reached out to you on email, I said a lot of the character formation of some of the characters in the book came directly from your criminology classes, your abnormal psychology classes. It was a really good base to get into the minds of some of them characters. So I can only imagine your students in Maynooth are very lucky to have you in there doing them classes. Thanks a million, Phil, and we will definitely run this back and do it again.
Pleasure, man. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a million. Cheers.